The world watched with smirks and condescension as young African leaders stood before microphones, declaring their nation's independence from centuries-old chains. Western commentators dismissed them as naive upstarts playing at geopolitics. Another military coup, they scoffed. Another African strongman making empty promises. But something extraordinary has been unfolding across the Sahel, something that has transformed skeptical laughter into nervous silence. Today, we witness the renaissance of African sovereignty, not through the rhetoric of yesteryear, but through strategic brilliance, economic innovation, and an unshakable commitment to continental self-determination. The architects of this transformation are not asking for permission, nor are they seeking validation from former colonial masters. They are simply building the Africa that was always meant to be. At the epicenter of this revolution stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, whose name now reverberates from Ouagadougou to Johannesburg, from Lagos to Nairobi. But this is not the story of one man. The skeptics had reason for their doubt. Africa's post-independence history is scarred with leaders who promised liberation but delivered oppression, who spoke of sovereignty while emptying state coffers, who wrapped themselves in Pan-African rhetoric while serving foreign interests. The continent had endured too many false prophets, too many promises broken on the altar of personal ambition. Yet within this historical context emerged a different breed of African leadership, one forged not in the comfortable corridors of Western universities or the boardrooms of multinational corporations, but in the crucible of genuine struggle for their people's welfare. These leaders understood that true sovereignty could not be gifted by external powers. It had to be seized and defended through strategic action. Ibrahim Traoré's rise to prominence in Burkina Faso exemplifies this new paradigm. Since assuming leadership, he has implemented significant educational reforms, including scholarship programs and fee reductions, while positioning himself as a revolutionary anti-imperialist, cutting ties with France and vowing to restore genuine sovereignty in a country long plagued by insurgency. But what makes Traoré remarkable is not just his policies. It's his understanding that African sovereignty requires both internal transformation and external independence. The traditional playbook of African liberation movements focused primarily on political independence: remove the colonial flag, install an African government, join the United Nations, and voila, freedom achieved. But Traoré and his contemporaries recognized that political independence without economic sovereignty is merely a sophisticated form of neo-colonialism. Consider the audacious strategic moves that have redefined West African geopolitics. In January 2023, Traoré expelled the French ambassador, calling France an imperialist state. 1 month later, he ordered French troops to leave Burkina Faso, sparking a wave of similar actions across formerly French West African nations. These were not impulsive decisions driven by anti-Western sentiment. They were calculated moves in a broader strategy of continental liberation. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States represents perhaps the most significant geopolitical realignment in West Africa since independence. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2024, establishing the AES as both a security alliance and later as a confederation. Critics initially dismissed this as the desperate gambit of isolated military regimes. They were spectacularly wrong. The economic performance of AES countries has been remarkable, with Burkina Faso achieving 4% GDP growth, Mali securing 3.751%, and Niger reaching an impressive 8% GDP growth in 2024. These numbers tell a story of economic vitality that contrasts sharply with the stagnation that characterized these nations under the tutelage of traditional Western-dominated institutions. But economic statistics only capture part of the transformation. The AES introduced a joint biometric passport in September 2024, making travel between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso seamless, while unveiling an official alliance flag that symbolizes their shared commitment to sovereignty. These practical steps toward integration demonstrate that African unity is not merely aspirational, it is operational. The strategic brilliance of leaders like Traoré lies in their understanding that sovereignty must be multidimensional. It requires military independence from foreign forces that ostensibly provide security while actually perpetuating dependency. It demands economic autonomy that prioritizes African value chains over extractive relationships with former colonial powers. It necessitates cultural renaissance that celebrates African knowledge systems, languages, and governance traditions. Under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso has launched national initiatives to promote Burkinabe identity, protect cultural heritage, and strengthen citizen unity, with government actions multiplying to showcase the country's cultural treasures, ancestral traditions, and local artistic works. This cultural dimension of sovereignty is often overlooked by external observers, but it represents the foundation upon which sustainable independence must be built. The laughter has stopped because the results speak louder than skepticism. When Western powers threatened sanctions against the AES countries, these nations didn't collapse, they thrived. When military support was withdrawn, they found alternative partnerships. When economic pressure was applied, they diversified their relationships and strengthened intra-African trade. The transformation extends far beyond the Sahel. Across the continent, African leaders are studying the AES model, recognizing that genuine sovereignty requires the courage to make difficult decisions that may initially invite criticism, but ultimately serve their people's long-term interests. The ripple effects of this sovereignty movement are being felt from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. What makes this movement particularly compelling is its authentic African character. These leaders speak in languages their people understand, reference historical figures who resonate with continental consciousness, and frame their policies within indigenous value systems that prioritize communal welfare over individual accumulation. They are not performing sovereignty for external audiences, they are living it for their citizens. The military dimension of sovereignty has been equally strategic. By diversifying security partnerships and reducing dependence on former colonial powers, AES countries have demonstrated that African nations can provide for their own defense. The replacement of Western military support with alternative partnerships, including cooperation with Russia's Wagner Group successor, illustrates the pragmatic approach these leaders have taken to security arrangements. Critics argue that this represents a mere substitution of one form of dependence for another. This criticism misses the fundamental difference between voluntary strategic partnerships and imposed colonial relationships. African leaders are now choosing their partners based on mutual benefit rather than accepting arrangements dictated by historical domination. The educational initiatives launched in Burkina Faso, including expanded access and scholarship programs, exemplify the transformative potential of authentic African leadership. These educational reforms represent a declaration that African human capital will no longer be constrained by economic barriers that perpetuate generational inequality. This investment in education represents faith in African intellectual capacity and determination to compete globally on African terms. Traoré has reignited Pan-African consciousness with a bold anti-imperialist agenda rooted in self-reliance, resource nationalism, and unity against neo-colonial influence, sparking solidarity movements across Africa and the diaspora. This consciousness-raising aspect of the sovereignty movement may be its most lasting contribution. The economic nationalism pursued by AES countries challenges the conventional wisdom that African development requires accepting unfavorable terms from international financial institutions. By prioritizing resource sovereignty and demanding equitable partnerships, these nations are creating a new template for African economic engagement with the world. The Alliance of Sahel States represents an attempt to uphold the demands of sovereignty and the right to self-determination, an agenda that resonates with the people of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. This popular support is crucial because sustainable sovereignty cannot be imposed from above. It must emerge from the collective will of African peoples. The generational aspect of this movement cannot be overlooked. The Alliance of Youth of the Sahel States held its General Assembly in Ouagadougou in February 2024, with young people from Mali and Niger affirming their support for the transformative dynamics underway in the AES countries. This youth engagement ensures that the sovereignty movement has deep roots and long-term sustainability. However, we must acknowledge the challenges that accompany this transformation. Violence linked to militant Islamist groups nearly doubled in Burkina Faso, from 3,621 fatalities in 2022 to 6,389 in 2024, with violence spreading throughout the country and increasing along southern borders. Security remains a significant concern, and the success of the sovereignty movement will ultimately be measured by its ability to provide safety and stability for African peoples. The honest assessment of these challenges does not diminish the significance of what is being achieved. Previous African leaders often ignored or minimized problems while making grandiose promises. The current generation of sovereignty advocates acknowledges difficulties while implementing concrete solutions. This combination of realism and determination distinguishes authentic liberation movements from mere power grabs. The international response to Africa's sovereignty assertion has been predictably hostile from quarters accustomed to African dependency. Burkina Faso's 37-year-old leader has drawn particular ire from the United States and other Western powers uncomfortable with his anti-imperialist stance. This hostility validates rather than undermines the sovereignty movement. It demonstrates that real change is occurring. Traoré's defiance of Western influence and resource nationalism has galvanized many Africans weary of neo-colonial dynamics. This galvanization represents perhaps the most significant political development in post-independence Africa, the emergence of a continental consciousness that prioritizes African interests over external approval. The sovereignty movement's success will ultimately be measured not by international recognition, but by tangible improvements in African lives. Free education, economic growth, cultural renaissance, and regional integration are concrete achievements that demonstrate the practical benefits of genuine independence. As we witness this historic transformation, we must recognize that the laughter has indeed stopped. What began as skepticism about another African military coup has evolved into serious concern among powers accustomed to African compliance. The men and women leading this sovereignty movement have proven that authentic African leadership is not only possible, but inevitable. Recent developments, including Traoré's strategic governance reforms and institutional restructuring, demonstrate the dynamic nature of leadership in transitional periods. These actions reflect the complex process of building new institutional frameworks while managing inherited political challenges. Despite ECOWAS offering a 6-month extension, the AES countries formally withdrew from the community in January 2025, marking the most significant crisis in West Africa's regional integration since ECOWAS's founding in 1975. This withdrawal represents not crisis, but opportunity. The chance to build African institutions that truly serve African interests. The transformation we are witnessing extends far beyond policy changes or institutional reforms. It represents a fundamental shift in African consciousness, from seeking accommodation within systems designed for African subordination to building alternatives based on African agency and self-determination. The world is no longer laughing at Africa's sovereignty movements because they can no longer dismiss their effectiveness. The combination of strategic thinking, practical implementation, and unwavering commitment to African interests has created a new reality that demands respect rather than ridicule. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter in African history, a chapter written by Africans, for Africans, with the understanding that true liberation requires both the vision to imagine a better future and the courage to build it despite opposition. The sovereignty movement spreading across Africa represents the maturation of Pan-African consciousness into practical governance. It demonstrates that Africans do not need permission to determine their own destiny, validation to pursue their own interests, or approval to celebrate their own achievements. The technological dimension of this sovereignty revolution deserves particular attention. While Western nations attempt to maintain digital colonialism through restrictive internet governance and technology transfer limitations, African leaders are pursuing indigenous technological solutions. Burkina Faso's investment in digital infrastructure, combined with partnerships that prioritize technology transfer rather than mere consumption, exemplifies this approach. The AES countries are collectively developing communication networks that cannot be easily disrupted by external actors, recognizing that information sovereignty is as crucial as political or economic independence. The agricultural revolution accompanying this political transformation represents perhaps the most profound challenge to neo-colonial structures. For decades, African nations were encouraged to focus on cash crop exports while importing basic food staples, creating artificial food insecurity that served as a tool of political control. The sovereignty movement has prioritized food self-sufficiency as a cornerstone of genuine independence. Traoré's administration has launched ambitious agricultural modernization programs that combine traditional farming wisdom with contemporary techniques. These initiatives recognize that African agricultural knowledge, developed over millennia, provides sustainable solutions that Western industrial agriculture often lacks. The emphasis on indigenous seeds, traditional crop rotation methods, and community-based farming cooperatives represents a rejection of the dependency model that has characterized African agriculture since colonialism. The mining sector presents another battleground where the sovereignty movement has achieved remarkable victories. Historically, African nations extracted raw materials under unfavorable terms that left minimal value within the continent. The new generation of African leaders insists on value-added processing, technology transfer, and equitable profit-sharing arrangements. Burkina Faso's approach to gold mining exemplifies this transformation. Rather than simply exporting raw gold to be processed elsewhere, the country has pursued partnerships that include local refining capabilities and jewelry manufacturing. This approach creates employment, develops technical expertise, and captures value that previously flowed entirely to external beneficiaries. The multiplication effect of such policies extends far beyond the mining sector, stimulating related industries and building industrial capacity. The healthcare sovereignty movement represents another dimension of this comprehensive transformation. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed Africa's dangerous dependence on external pharmaceutical supplies and medical expertise. The sovereignty movement has responded by investing in indigenous pharmaceutical manufacturing, traditional medicine research, and medical training programs that reduce dependence on external health interventions. Traditional African medicine, long dismissed by Western medical establishments, is experiencing renaissance as African scientists apply rigorous research methodologies to validate and improve indigenous healing practices. This approach respects African knowledge systems while meeting contemporary scientific standards, creating healthcare solutions that are both culturally appropriate and medically effective. The environmental stewardship aspect of Africa's sovereignty movement offers lessons for global sustainability challenges. African traditional governance systems often incorporated sophisticated environmental management practices that maintained ecological balance over centuries. Contemporary African leaders are reviving these approaches while adapting them to modern challenges. The Great Green Wall Initiative, spanning multiple Sahel nations, including those in the AES, demonstrates how African environmental wisdom can address global climate challenges. This massive reforestation and land restoration project combines traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary environmental science, creating sustainable development models that other regions increasingly study and emulate. Cultural sovereignty represents the foundation upon which all other forms of independence rest. The revival of African languages in education, governance, and commerce challenges the linguistic colonialism that has marginalized indigenous knowledge systems for generations. When African leaders conduct official business in African languages, they assert cultural autonomy that resonates deeply with their populations. The promotion of African art, music, literature, and film through sovereign cultural policies creates alternative narratives that challenge Western-dominated media representations of Africa. These cultural productions celebrate African achievement, wisdom, and beauty while addressing contemporary challenges through African perspectives and solutions. The gender dimension of Africa's sovereignty movement deserves recognition for its progressive approaches to women's empowerment. Unlike Western feminist models that often conflict with African cultural values, the sovereignty movement has developed African feminist frameworks that honor traditional women's roles while expanding opportunities for contemporary female leadership. Women's participation in the AES governance structures, economic initiatives, and security arrangements demonstrates how authentic African leadership naturally incorporates gender equity without external pressure or cultural imperialism. This organic approach to women's empowerment achieves sustainable progress because it emerges from African values rather than imposed foreign standards. The educational philosophy underlying Africa's sovereignty movement extends far beyond policy reforms to encompass fundamental questions about knowledge production and dissemination. African educational institutions are increasingly developing curricula that prioritize African history, philosophy, science, and technology while maintaining global competitiveness. This educational transformation produces graduates who understand both African and global contexts, creating leaders capable of engaging internationally while maintaining African perspectives and priorities. The intellectual confidence generated by such education systems provides the foundation for sustained sovereignty in all sectors. The diplomatic revolution accompanying Africa's sovereignty movement has fundamentally altered international relations on the continent. Rather than accepting junior partner status in international forums, African nations are asserting equal partnership demands and creating alternative diplomatic frameworks when existing institutions prove inadequate. The AES diplomatic coordination demonstrates how smaller African nations can achieve greater international influence through strategic alliance building. Their collective negotiating power in international forums exceeds what any individual member could achieve, providing a model for broader African diplomatic coordination. The religious and spiritual dimensions of Africa's sovereignty movement acknowledge the profound role that faith plays in African societies. Rather than importing foreign religious interpretations that diminish African worth, the sovereignty movement has encouraged African religious scholarship that celebrates African spiritual traditions while embracing universal religious principles. This approach recognizes that spiritual independence supports political and economic sovereignty by affirming African dignity and divine purpose. The integration of African spiritual wisdom with contemporary governance challenges creates holistic leadership approaches that address both material and spiritual needs of African populations. The media and communication strategies employed by sovereignty movement leaders represent sophisticated understanding of contemporary information warfare. Rather than relying exclusively on foreign media outlets that often misrepresent African perspectives, these leaders have developed indigenous media platforms that tell African stories from African viewpoints. Social media utilization by leaders like Traoré demonstrates how contemporary technology can amplify authentic African voices, while bypassing traditional gatekeepers who have historically controlled African narratives. This direct communication with both African and global audiences creates unprecedented opportunities for African leaders to explain their policies and vision without external mediation or distortion. As this movement continues to grow and evolve, it carries the hopes and dreams of millions of Africans who have waited too long for leadership that truly represents their aspirations. The laughter has stopped because the skeptics have been proven wrong. Africa's time has arrived, and the world is finally paying attention. If this analysis of Africa's sovereignty renaissance resonates with you, show your support by clicking that like button, because every engagement helps spread awareness of these transformative movements across the continent. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell to stay informed about the latest developments in African geopolitics and sovereignty movements. Your subscription directly supports independent media coverage of African perspectives often ignored by mainstream outlets. Share this video with friends, family, and colleagues who need to understand the profound changes reshaping African politics and international relations. Comment below with your thoughts on these sovereignty movements and let us know which African leaders and initiatives you'd like us to cover next. Together, we can amplify African voices and perspectives in the global conversation about sovereignty, self-determination, and genuine independence. Like, subscribe, share, and join the movement supporting African agency in determining Africa's future.